¿Ya conoces las publicaciones del Centro Olof Palme? Te invitamos a conocer la seguridad humana y la seguridad multidimensional a debate. Amenazas, riesgos y vulnerabilidades en el mundo del siglo XXI. Bajo la autoría de 11 especialistas, coordinados por María Cristina Rosas. En esta obra aprenderás sobre diferentes aristas de la seguridad, relacionadas con el terrorismo, el proteccionismo, la energía, los derechos humanos, las relaciones norteamericanas, la delincuencia organizada y el poder naval, entre otros. Adquiere ya La seguridad humana y la seguridad multidimensional a debate. Amenazas, riesgos y vulnerabilidades en el mundo del siglo XXI. Envíanos un mensaje a través de nuestras redes sociales para adquirir esta y otras obras del Centro Olof Palme México. Contáctanos hoy mismo.
Good afternoon, Mexico. Good evening, Uppsala, Stockholm, Sweden. Welcome. Welcome to another session of this special production made by the Olof Palme Center in Mexico, An Afternoon With. I am very honored to introduce to you today one of the most prominent experts in the field of peace and conflict research, Professor Peter Wallensteen. Peter, it's really a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to start by introducing our guest, and I will say a few words about his very extensive resume. Peter Wallensteen is a senior professor in the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Sweden's Uppsala University, where he directed the Uppsala Conflict Data Program until 2015 and continues to lead the special program on the implementation of target sanctions. He was the first holder of the Hammarskjöld Chair in Peace and Conflict Research between 1985 and 2012. He is the author of the widely used Understanding Conflict Resolution, Peace, War, and the Global System, now in its fourth edition and published in English, Arabic, and Korean. He is also the author of Peace Research, Theory and Practice, published in English and Chinese. In 2016, Wallensteen and Isaac Svensson published The Diplomats of Peace, Nordic Mediation from Bernadotte to Ahtisaari, which analyzed the work of over 40 mediators. The book serves as a follow-up text to Wallensteen and Svensson's The Go-Between, Jan Eliasson and the Styles of Mediation. Wallenstein's monograph Quality Peace, Peacebuilding, Victory and World Order constitutes part of a multi-volume series on strategic peacebuilding developed by the Kroc Institute and Oxford University Press. Wallensteen is co-editor of Regional Organizations and Peacemaking, Challengers to the UN. His interest in target sanctions led him to publish the edited volume International Sanctions, Between Wars and Wars in 2005. The report Making Target Sanctions Effective was the outcome of a large international process for improving sanctions and was presented to the UN Security Council in February 2003. You may remember that was a time when Iraq was about to be attacked by the United States. The same year, Wallenstein's edited book on Nobel Peace Prize laureate Alva Myrdal in International Affairs was published. Peter Wallensteen joined the faculty of the Kroc Institute in 2006. He spends the fall semesters in residence at Notre Dame, where he consults and collaborates with faculty and research projects, teaches a graduate seminar on international peace research, and lectures on peace research topics. I should probably add that Peter Wallensteen has contributed to the academic community of several countries in the fields of peace research and conflict resolution. And it's really an honor to have the possibility of having him today to discuss a number of issues of relevance in today's world. So in that respect, I would like to take advantage of the limited time we have and ask you, Peter, about an initial assessment about today's world armed conflicts and peace processes. Having in mind, you remember that last year, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked the world to stop armed conflicts because he mentioned that if we have armed conflicts plus the pandemic, the most vulnerable peoples of the world may be very, very adversely affected. So what is your take on today's armed conflicts and peace processes all over the world?
Thank you very much, Maria Cristina, for this introduction. It's really a pleasure to meet you again, as we have had the opportunity to meet at other junctures, even here in cold Uppsala in northern Europe. So it's really, for me, fascinating to follow what you are doing, and I'm really happy to be part of this dialogue. Yeah, let me get to your question, and I'll actually use this function of share screen, and we shall see how that works. And here is the most difficult part. Find the right one. There we are. Yeah.
There it is.
Yes, this is just another advertisement. You had such a nice display of books in the beginning. But this is my latest work, and I like it in the sense that it tells us that peace is researchable, and that's the whole idea, that peace can be studied. And I do remember the first time I said this to people here in Sweden, and a very prominent professor of political science said, no, you cannot study peace. There are too many variables involved. And I thought that was a little silly answer, but I was a polite young student at the time. I think it can be, and so the idea is really to show the various aspects of peace and how they can be studied. And of course, peace research in the northern part of the world grew up very much under the threat of the nuclear weapons. And here you have a graph showing, from the first bomb in Hiroshima, which of course is something we can highlight as it took place on the 6th of August in 1945. And you can see the enormous rise here of nuclear warheads that were in the arsenals of the various countries. So this was really the first challenge of peace research, what to do with this. And lots of ideas were generated in this period here, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And some of them were actually being used when the Cold War ends. And you can see a reduction here, which is down now to a level where we are maybe 10 or 15,000. It's still very much, but it is encouraging because it says, no, you can, with rational argument and good politics, you can really change things. Now, that has, of course, been followed by the next problem, the one you allude to, the armed conflicts. So this is a graph trying to show the amount of armed conflict, which was also rising together with the nuclear weapons. And then they were also reducing after the Cold War, and you see them go down. But there again, you see another rise. And the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen a lot of conflicts in the world. And that is really a challenge. Why are they happening, and where are they happening? And here you can see that most of them are in Africa, which is in blue, or in Asia, which is in yellow. But no region is spared of this. Of course, the Americas are there, the Middle East is there, but also Europe. So I think this is the really new challenge that we need to think a lot about. And in the last 2 years, it has generated, since the end of the Cold War, these kind of spikes, not only of the number of conflicts that I mentioned, but also the number of people that die in them. And you see then a huge number in the early 90s, then another peak here in the late 90s. And this is very much in Africa and the Horn of Africa. But then, of course, you see the latest one, which is the Middle East, which is a real challenge. So there is a need for also a more regional form of analysis, I think, of what to do. And let me just jump very quickly to this graph, which is the same, the total number of armed conflict going up like this. And down here are the number of peace processes. And you can see that in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, there were lots of peace processes going on. And then they have almost disappeared. There's very little. And you can see also that they really did result in a lot in the 90s and up till 2003. And today, when we have this new spike of conflicts, we do not see the same ambitions to try to deal with this in a peaceful way. So that is very quickly an answer to your question, but it tells me here are real important challenges for us. Wherever we are in the world and where there are conflicts, we need to find ways to deal with them.
Yes, Peter. I was taking a look at CIPRI's figures on military expenditure for last year. Last year was a pandemic. Well, we still have the pandemic. But what strikes me is that military expenditure grew 2.6. One may think that because we have a pandemic, countries may want to reduce a bit the military expenditure. In fact, some countries did that. Chile, South Korea, they decided to move more onto the supporting of health services and such. But the US increased its military budget. The UK, for instance, announced that it's going to develop new nuclear weapons. So the international environment seems very much attached to military budget that seems to continue. So what's your take on that?
No, I agree with your observations, and you referred to the Secretary General and his asking for a sort of global ceasefire when we saw the COVID. And then you could see how that was treated in the Security Council, where the big powers were very reluctant to go along with this rather simple and humanitarian idea. And finally, there was some support, but it showed really that the big powers in the world were not at all inclined to think about solving conflicts. And Britain, of course, a nice, reasonable democracy, but still they go into this new phase of nuclear weapons. So it is really striking that the thinking about peace has been, so to say, marginalized in a way which I think is really very dangerous. And we constantly need to raise this issue. No, what are you doing with our resources? And why are you not concentrating on solving these armed conflicts that go on, but rather seem to be fueling them with weapons and political support to different actors?
Yes. At the beginning of this year, there was some hope, I think, because the treaty banning nuclear weapons came into force. Yet major nuclear weapons didn't join the agreement. But well, I have always believed that it's better to have an agreement than otherwise. So I would like to ask you, you already mentioned...
It is.
Yes, the UN Security Council's role during the pandemic. And I remember some years ago, you wrote a piece on the anniversary of the United Nations, and you mentioned in your analysis that we were in need of bringing back the United Nations as a key actor in mediation and conflict resolution. And I would like to ask you about that, because there's a lot of talk these days about the crisis of institutions and the credibility of the UN. What would you say about that?
Yeah, no, I still think this is the most reasonable way of dealing with things, is to use the United Nations. But I have looked at, for instance, the use of the veto by there are 5 countries, as we do remember, that have this right to block any decision. And they actually have been doing that more frequently in the last 2 years than before. And when one blocks, it means it blocks a proposal from another side, which often also is set to be provocative. So it is a good illustration that the cooperation is not functioning. Yes. And as I showed very quickly in that graph, with the rising number of conflicts, but we do not see a similar rise in activity in the Security Council. And that's what we need to think of. And I always try to say, whenever I have a chance to meet people from these 5 countries that have, interest and concern, that you have to see this as a deal. We in the rest of the world gave you this right to block things, but we did that with an expectation that you should act in the global interest, not just in your national interest. Yes. And I'm sorry to see that you too often act in your national interest only, but that's not the deal. The deal is that you have this special position in the UN Charter to act responsibly for what is of global concern. Now that leads often to an interesting philosophical discussion, where some of these countries claim that they do represent the global interest, but I think the pressure has to be there politically on these powers, that they need to see their role not just as and the UN not just as a tool for their foreign policy compared to NATO or some other alliance. No, the UN is a special arena, and it has a global mandate and a global assignment, and they must live up to that.
What would you suggest to improve the role of the UN in today's crisis as a key actor in dealing with peace, with security, and human rights issues? What would you do? What would you suggest?
I compare to Dag Hammarskjöld that you mentioned initially, and he managed to create a sort of an alliance between himself as the second UN Secretary General and the General Assembly, and particularly the third world countries. And that was a strong connection that he managed to make. And together they could try to constrain the big powers. And this is in the 1950s, this is in the middle of the Cold War. And I think these are the kind of coalitions that are needed also on the international level. And we should encourage the present Secretary General, Guterres, who I think is a good thinking man. And he's now up for re-election, and I think he will be re-elected. But to develop such a coalition in order to have a stronger role for the UN and expose these big powers to some pressure. Because of course it is like this, that even if the rest of the world does not have a veto, its votes are needed to make positive decisions.
Yes.
So they have, so to say, a hidden veto there, and I would wish that one used that as a tool to put pressure.
I do agree. Normally, when we look at the UN, we tend to look mostly to the Security Council, but still there are other bodies that probably, if they are more active, can counterbalance the paralysis of the Security Council. And yes, you are right. Hammarskjöld risked many things to make the UN work. And in fact, the General Assembly was very active, for example, in approving peacekeeping operations and other important measures to contribute to peace and conflict resolution throughout the world. And I would like to ask you, we already have approached to the peacekeeping operations issue. The Secretary General, by the way, has found very difficult for the Security Council to create new peacekeeping operations. I believe this is part of this paralysis, the veto between the US, Russia, and now China, of course. And he made a proposal, I'm sure you've analyzed this, the Action for Peace, that is entitled to promote political negotiations so that conflicts around the world can come to a solution without a deployment of a huge peacekeeping operation. I believe there's also a monetary or money constraint in dealing with peacekeeping operations because, some of them are extremely expensive, and this is becoming a problem for the whole UN. So would you say this initiative, Action for Peace, and the move towards using more political tools rather than deployment tools is a good way to go in dealing with today's threats to international peace and security?
I think that's a way forward, and I think you are right that one is using this economic argument against more peacekeeping. Although we know that the peacekeeping operations actually do function, they do work in reducing the amount of violence in a particular situation. So I think we should not forget about it, but it is important right now politically to go for proposals like he's making. As you mentioned initially, I've done some work with looking at mediators of various sorts, particularly from Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And it's interesting to ask them, what do they want? What do they need? And for instance, Ambassador Eliasson, you referred to, yes. He says, no, as a mediator, I do not want to be involved and have pressure and put pressure. But he said, it's good to have some funder in the background. And with that, he meant that if his mission, for instance, with Darfur in Sudan, has the support of the Security Council, that helps. And that can be enough to get the parties to change their behavior and be responsible. And you look at some of those who have been mediators for Syria, they have not had that support, and their roles have been constrained by the actions of major powers. So again, it shows, yes, these big powers are important, but one has to find ways around that. And I think our present Secretary General is a brave gentleman who is trying to find new ways forward.
What are the characteristics for a good mediator? What would you say are the best tools for somebody who wants to be a mediator? We have many examples in the case of Sweden. I was thinking while you were speaking about Hans Blix and the difficult time he had in dealing with the forbidden weapons in Iraq and the way he was treated by the United States and the Bush administration. But what would you say are the best tools for a mediator?
Yes, most of the mediators that we see have a keen understanding of the politics and political life. Some of them are former politicians, but many are ambassadors or have had other high positions. And I think that's probably good. You need to understand how politics really work, and it as an academic, I have been involved in a couple of such situations, and I notice that I don't really know exactly how a prime minister has to function, because he is building, he's thinking about his coalition that he makes his government, he's thinking about the next election, he's thinking about the challenge there.
Right.
And then in the middle, he wants to negotiate. And I'm just there helping to negotiate. So you need to have a sort of holistic understanding of the situation. And I think then that the best mediators are probably people who are more locally in place and can understand these localities. And sometimes we look for, so to say, star mediators who come in, who are almost on the celebrity level. Well, they cannot really function unless there are people on the local ground who knows exactly what is going on.
Right.
So I am in favor of mediation teams and that they actually have headquarters in the countries where they are negotiating so that they can understand it. They cannot just fly in, do a big show and hope things will happen. No, they have to be much more entrenched. And those that can really be of a good assistance here are the civil society organizations. They know the situations, people that work with these issues locally. They have their own agendas, of course, but they are really a good source of information. I discovered in the things I was doing that also the universities were good. There are always good academics who know a lot about things. And I'm often surprised to see that these mediators very seldom use the university and the knowledge. For me, that's obvious that one should do that. But people are helpful, and most people want to help in stopping a war or finding a solution. So I think there are more untapped resources here. Civil society and academia is definitely a part of that.
I have to say I agree with you because I am an academic, and for instance I have worked on human security, and there's always this criticism coming from politicians and practitioners who say that we in the academic world are far away from what the real world is. So I would say that in the academic world, yes, we produce a lot of views and analysis on today's problems, but we need to connect better with those who make decisions. And I think that's a real challenge, Peter.
It is. But just to give you another example, we arranged a dialogue, we meaning our Department of Peace Research in Uppsala, between Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay.
At a time when the PLO was still defined as a terrorist organization and Israelis were not allowed to meet them, but Israelis were allowed to go to academic conferences of relevance. So we arranged an academic conference, and then we invited people also from the PLO, but of course people with more of an academic background, but with good political connections. And Israelis and also some neutrals, so to say. And it was fascinating to see the way we could actually discuss in a sort of seminar style more about finding solutions and generating ideas. So you can create an atmosphere here where the academics can actually play a really significant role without the academics themselves becoming politicians, so to say, but their knowledge is useful. And even our way of operating with seminars and thinking about methods, all that is actually helpful in solving conflicts as well.
Absolutely, I agree. And we tend to forget that we can provide the scenario and facilitate, the dialogue between conflicting parties, and we shouldn't forget that. That's a good reminder.
No.
What you mentioned. There is something I have always wanted to ask you about the leverage of mediators, because, for instance, we can think about a number of mediators, American mediators, that have used leverage to force conflicting parties to reach an agreement. I'm thinking about the Camp David agreements, for instance. How important is to have leverage for a mediator?
Yes, it's a real big discussion. I mean, mediators with muscle or various expressions like that. So I and Isak Svensson in our work, we have divided between what we call those mediators that work with forcing and those that work with fostering. Yes. And we don't really have good statistics what works the best. But clearly you can say with a fostering approach, it means you're trying to convince the parties, and that makes it easier for the parties to become involved themselves and take the responsibility for the outcome and says, okay, this is our agreement, and then we will implement it. But if it is forced on the parties, and you mentioned Camp David, I'm thinking about the Dayton Accords that ends the terrible war in Bosnia, but it is really very much forced on the parties. And they have to live with it, and it works as long as they feel that there is this pressure. But still, it's not really their agreement. And I think that's the difference here. You can stop war with these kind of forceful approaches, threats, even bombardments and so on, and get the parties to sign an agreement. But if they get a chance, they'll probably jump out of it. But if you have a more fostering approach, then they think it is there, and the mediator, have to swallow his or her pride, because the idea is that it should be their agreement, and then they are more likely to stick to it, I think. But we would need more statistics on that. But it also creates a much better environment in terms of quality peace and so on, to get an agreement that parties really themselves stick to. It's better than that they are looking around and see is there a pressure coming or not before they do their action.
Yes, I believe this, mediation with a muscle. Well, the muscle is not always there. I believe the mediator will go away at some point, and then a conflicted relationship may develop one more time between the parties. So I like much more what you are suggesting, fostering peace, which leads me to another question. You've been working a lot on quality peace. And, there's been a lot of talk about peace with adjectives, positive peace. And there are many concepts around peace beyond, not war, beyond the meaning of peace equals no war. I believe that's much more to say about peace. So could you say a few words about the ideas on quality peace you have been thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this, as you mentioned, I spent for a period of time as a professor at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame in the US. And of course, they are very much involved in the Colombia peace agreement, for instance. Yes. There was a lot to talk about what they call structural peace building. What do we do after war and the peace agreement, and how has it worked out? So peace building became a concept that was tied to the idea of a peace agreement that we then are building. But of course, you can imagine a victory also resulting in peace, and many people would claim that they do. So I thought, no, we need to have a concept that covers both situations, both the negotiated and the forced, the military solution. And so I said that should be quality peace, and we should then think about what should it contain. What is really a quality peace? A situation where war does not recur, come back again. And looking at all the data and all the information we have on these conflicts, there were three things that struck me to be important. One is the human respect for human dignity, that is human rights, gender equality, minority rights. All that seems to be really very important, because one driving force for conflict is discrimination or marginalization of various sorts. So the reverse, of course, is then to accept human dignity. The other is the thing that you have worked a lot on human security, that people feel safe, physically safe. But I in that also include that they should have a good chance to a job and a good employment and so on. That would be part of human security and safety. And the third one is that there is hope, that there is a expectation for the future, that this will be lasting, and that the war will not come back. And when I look at that and then compare the outcomes with peace, negotiated peace, and those with military victories,
yes,
it's quite clear that those with negotiated outcomes give a much better quality to the life of a country after that. And there is less likely that the war will return. In the cases of victory, yes, the war ends, but it often means that one group takes all the power and suppresses another group, and then the other group sort of expects the war to come back again, or because they experience discrimination and so on and so forth. So it became quite clear statistically that negotiated settlements for civil wars were normally resulting in a better quality of that peace. So that's what I think it could be seen as quality peace. And then we can philosophize much more about it, as you indicated, with negative and positive peace. But this is a way of trying to specify a little more what positive peace actually should include, and try to do it with a basis in the evidence that we have generated in peace research, international relations, sociology, etc.
yes, yes. I was thinking about Machiavelli when you spoke, when he mentioned about military victories, and he said that the winner has to be merciful to those he eventually, was able to eliminate, or I don't know. So we don't see that.
No.
When we analyze conflicts and proposals for peace, I have seen this trend to look in terms of black and white. What I win, you lose, and because I won, you have to lose. And I don't believe the world is like that. We have to come to a better understanding about the nature of conflicts. And there's another concept, sustainable peace. And I find what you mentioned right now, quality peace, very attached to this idea of sustainable peace. Peace needs to be sustainable. Peace needs to go on after a conflict, because we have seen so many conflicts, so many peace processes. I think of Haiti, for instance, and other countries in the world, Congo, for instance, in Central Africa, that have moved from a conflict and a peace settlement and another conflict and another peace settlement. This is a never-ending story. So yes, I believe we should look more into quality peace. I agree.
Yeah, yeah. No, I of course agree with you that we need to see this also as a way of preventing conflict for the future, and so you can think about it even in situations where there is no war going on right now. One can still say, no, there are maybe things that are going in the wrong direction. Discrimination is increasing, democracy is undermined. Well, those are dangerous signs of what the future could entail.
Right. Yes, and there are many challenges, environmental challenges and food challenges, and so many. All the areas covered by human security, and even areas not mentioned in the concept of human security, are very challenging in today's world. So we should pay attention to all of them, to all and each of them. I would like to invite our audience to send us your questions for our guest. And well, I would like you to, if possible, say a few words about sanctions. I remember I talked to you many years ago, many months ago, when I was writing the book behind me on sanctions, and it was 2003. It was the time when the US wanted to start a war against Iraq, and it used the issue of forbidden weapons as a pretext to start this war. And I remember we discussed a lot the issues pertaining comprehensive sanctions against target sanctions. And there were also other concepts such as smart sanctions, silly sanctions, dumb sanctions. So there were many adjectives referring to sanctions. But at the end, I believe that sanctions have evolved as a concept and as a political tool to force countries who are risking international peace to behave in a better way. I was reading a study by Anders Aslund on sanctions against Russia. He just published this study for the Atlantic Council, I think. And he comes to the conclusion that sanctions against Russia have had mixed results. And yes, they have worked, but they have not been as strong as expected because of this, dependence on fossil fuels by Europe on Russia. So my question is, are we really moving in the assumption that sanctions work, and how they work? How are they crafted in today's world? Or is it better to work in terms of constructive engagement instead of sanctions? Because, we have seen Cuba with these sanctions by the US, these never-ending sanctions by the US, and Cuba tends to use the argument of sanctions as a tool to justify many problems that the government has in dealing with the well-being of the population. President Diaz-Canel blames sanctions for the problems of Cuba. So what's your take on sanctions today?
Yeah, I think the world is too quick to use the sanctions, because they look forceful from the point of view of a government, and it can say, yes, we do react to these things, and look here, we are actually banning this and that, and it's too easily done. And one needs to do exactly like you indicate, and that Professor Åslund indicate in that article. You have to look at the other side also. How will they react? What will the government do? And it's very clear that the governments are trying to be smart to use these sanctions for their own purposes. So they can proclaim that this is a national emergency, dissident voices are dangerous, they are not patriotic, and they can take a lot of measures to increase their control over the economy, and in that sense undermine some of the effects. So I think one should be more careful with using the sanctions, because we need these kind of so to say, not violent, not military means in the world too. We need to develop them. And that was my purpose with being involved with sanctions. How can we make them better? And the idea with smart sanctions was that they should be targeting only those individuals that were responsible for the policies. They should be hurt. And so we did a study to see how had the UN actually been using these smart sanctions. And it turns out that they very often avoid targeting those that are really responsible. So they are not targeting Putin himself, yes, but the European Union is targeting people around, yes, Putin. Yes. But, what does that do? And I guess they do that because they don't want to be that provocative. But that undermines the whole idea with the smart sanctions. Also, the other part of the smart sanctions, which I think is perhaps the most important, at least in civil war situations, is the arms embargo. And that we can really see that if you can impose an arms embargo on the fighting parties, because most wars are taking place in countries where people are dependent on continuous arms flow, well, then we can see that they become more interested in a negotiated settlement if there is a threat to the continued arms flow that they have. So for civil wars, I think arms embargoes can probably be very good. Right now, I'm thinking a lot what to do with sanctions in terms of preventing nuclear proliferation. Iran, right, North Korea, etc. Right. Are the sanctions really the right thing to do here? I'm not convinced that they are. I'm not sure they are achieving. On the contrary, it's like North Korea or the Iranian leadership, which is really very conservative. It almost strengthens them in their belief that we cannot make any deals with the rest of the world. Look how terrible they are against us. So we need to find some other way. Positive sanctions would perhaps be rewards for good behavior, could be a way out or something like that. What I discovered when we looked at it is that these sanctions work somewhere between 20% and 33% of the cases. In civil war situations, they can be more effective, particularly if there is also a peacekeeping operation going on, for instance. Then the effectiveness increases. Now, I have asked my colleagues in various war colleges how effective is actually military action. Can you give me similar numbers? Are you 20%, 33%, or what are you? And very seldom is that analysis made.
Okay.
I've seen one study which looked at air campaigns, like bombing countries with your airplanes, like North Vietnam was bombed, or Germany bombed Britain during the Second World War, the Blitz and so on. And all the studies showed that this was not very effective. On the contrary, it made people stronger in supporting their own government. So this as a military instrument doesn't really work. And I actually presented this even to a seminar with the Swedish Air Force. And I thought they would be very unhappy with me, but they said, no, that's probably true. You know, we are just complementary to ground forces and real invasions. That's what helped. Well, indeed, we can look at that too. So we have not evaluated military means in a similar way that we evaluate economic sanctions. And that's what I would like to see. And then we can see which one is really most effective. Indeed, many instruments are not so effective as we would want them to be. And that's why we need to look at things like you mentioned, constructive engagement or positive sanctions or things like that, to see if there are other things that are better in this very, so to say, pluralistic international system where there is not one single government, but 200 different governments.
Right. Yes, there's the issue of retaliation also. For instance, we have seen that many products, Russian products, have been targeted, and then Russia applies sanctions against products from Western countries and such. So the issue of retaliation is also interesting. And I was thinking about China. China has been sanctioned due to the events of Tiananmen in 1989. But still, China is doing very well, I think, in the economy, and all the countries that sanction China in terms of not selling arms to China are having businesses with China in other areas. So in this respect, I would say that China, the only thing that did when it was sanctioned by Western countries is that it decided to buy weapons from Russia. And that was it. So in this is an example of the complexity of sanctions, right?
It is, yes. And you get unlikely allies, suddenly supporting you. I'm thinking, as you mentioned, Cuba, Castro in the beginning was not really a Soviet ally or anything, but the US sanctions forced him to deal with the Soviets, and then they were willing, but in return they wanted the bases and so on. So in that sense, it pushed him in that direction. And that's one of the negative things with sanctions. So I think they should be used very carefully. And I see there is also a question here from somebody, Marie Cruz Amador, about Latin America.
About Latin America, what particular interest you have in your analysis on peace about Latin America? You already mentioned the peace process in Colombia. I don't know if you would like to mention that.
Yeah, I think that one is really interesting. because that involves so much of a constructive learning from other peace processes. So I think the peace agreement that was concluded in 2016 is really unique. And it has one very interesting, unique provision, and that is that the implementation should be monitored by a research group at the Kroc Institute in University of Notre Dame. So that's something I've been involved with. So if you are interested, you go to the Peace Accords Matrix project at Kroc Institute in University of Notre Dame. And they have an off-spin then, which is called the Barometer Project. And that is following the implementation of the peace agreement. And I think in total, the peace agreement has about 500 different provisions. So there's quite a lot they have promised. And often they have a sort of a timeline when things should be done and so on. So it is a monitorable agreement. I think that one is really, it struggles on. It is a reasonable success. But as you all know, there is another guerrilla group that seemed to gain some strength and was not part of this agreement, the ELN. But the relationship with FARC seems to hold up anyway. So it is still a very interesting agreement, a very important agreement. But Latin America also illustrates another problem, and that is that armed conflicts today are not necessarily those that are just political. Right. There are also a lot of drug trades, drug lords, and other kinds of fights that takes place between these different cartels and things like that. And I mean, you in Mexico, I don't need to tell you about this. But that is something that we, as peace researchers, have tended to say that that's things for criminologists or the police or something like that. But I think we need to be more attentive to this because it has rather large effects on the population. And it creates a lot of fear and a lot of insecurity. And we should take them really more serious, I think, than we have done. So here is a new challenge for peace research to really deal with this. And what you deal with in Latin America for us can be useful to learn from in Europe.
Yes, I remember back in 2005, I talked to Alison Bales, who at that time was leading the CIPRI. And they asked me to write an analysis about security in Latin America. And when I look at your graphs, the graphs you presented at the beginning of this session, Latin America doesn't seem to be a very conflicted region as opposed to other regions that you show in the graphs. Yet there is a lot of violence linked to organized crime. And well, I have found now in the CIPRI yearbooks that Mexico is mentioned as a very, very violent country due to the activities of organized crime. So that tells you that there are different ways of studying conflicts. Conflicts are different in each part of the world, in each country. And in the case of Latin America, it's mostly organized crime that is, creating a number of problems in our countries.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that peace research should not just be concerned with the global issues, but it has to be very local and understand the local situations. And what you mentioned is another worrying sign for me is the backsliding, so to say, of democracy, and that people are voting for fairly authoritarian leaderships. And that's also worrying. And that's happening all over the world. Latin America has its experience. United States, but also in Europe, there is a lot of this. And that's also something worrying because we can see, we have a lot of data showing that democracies don't fight wars with other democracies. And even internally, democracies are normally less violent, not always. Democracies can be extremely violent, particularly if there is an ethnic divide. Right. I mean, Israel is always seen as a big democracy, but the Palestinians would not accept that description.
Yeah.
or Northern Ireland, which is suddenly coming back again. Here is a democracy that one can see the difficulties for it to deal with this kind of situation.
Right.
So there are lots of challenges also for democracies, and this trend towards authoritarianism is just adding to these problems.
Yes, we have some questions. There is a question in Facebook. It's very interesting. Amelia asks you, why would you say Sweden has produced so many prominent mediators and diplomats such as Jan Eliasson, Olof Palme, Pierre Curie, and such?
Yeah. It's a real good question, and I don't have a good answer. I think, I mean, it's a high competence, lots of concern about the international situation, lots of interest in international affairs. And of course, in the case of Sweden, we have been seen as not having vested interest in other places, and also trying to really solve things also internally through dialogues and so on. And many of these people that you mentioned, like Olof Palme, he was of course trying to solve problems in Sweden in the same way as he would go about it internationally. So maybe there is a culture of trying to find reasonable solutions, and maybe a strong belief in rationality. And that may have made Swedes particularly useful during the Cold War or immediately after.
Oh, yes.
When we today see a lot of religious conflicts, I'm not sure the Swedes are as good or well equipped to deal with this, as it's a very secular society. One needs to learn definitely more about the impact of religion on people's lives.
True.
So there are limits also to this. So those are some of the answers I would give.
Yes.
But Norway and Finland, of course, has also been very active.
Yes.
And sometimes there is a difference. Norway has, in a way, specialized in a bit to deal with groups that are seen as terrorists almost. I mean, they have, of course, worked with the Sri Lankans and with the Tamil Tigers.
True.
They have worked with Hamas, they worked with PLO. They have also connections to the Taliban. That's a little of their specialty, so to say. Whereas Finland has often been involved in conflicts where the solution is sort of autonomy arrangements, like in Aceh or in Kosovo and things like that. And that draws on experiences from Finland itself, which has a very functioning autonomous arrangement, which has been around for 100 years. So you can see that there is also some national backgrounds that have an impact on how and why they are involved in particular conflicts.
That is true. There is a question here, it's in Spanish, I'm going to translate it. It says that it is true that the Cuban government uses the speech of sanctions as a tool to justify a number of shortcomings of the administration. But on the other hand, it is true that the sanctions applied by the US government plays a role. And this person also asks about international actors who may contribute to, influence conflicting parties beyond the role of the Pope, such as businessmen, for instance. What do you think?
Yes, really interesting. We have actually tried to find businessmen that are involved in mediation, which would make a lot of sense, because businessmen should be good in negotiations and so on. But we find that they're very reluctant to be involved, and often they are not good at making a more deep-going political analysis. They are good at running businesses, but that doesn't mean that they understand what politicians have to deal with. I think that's some of the reasons why we don't see them as much. But with respect to Cuba, I think the European Union as a whole has played an important role in trying to soften the situation. I think the Pope, why not use him? He is a reasonable person as well. But so much of US politics against Cuba is not really about Cuba. It's about the United States itself, and about various Cuban exile groups in the US pushing and having a significant role in some key states like Florida. So that's another thing which complicates things. If it were just a matter of trying to solve the issues between the United States and Cuba, I think you could do it, you could find a way to deal with it. If you go back to nationalizations, compensation, things like that. But even talking about such things are immediately stopped politically. So I think that contributes to why it is so difficult to end these sanctions. And that's another problem to sanctions, is that once you have imposed them, it is often very hard to lift them because it looks like a concession. And people will ask, oh, what did they achieve? Did they do something? And if they didn't, it looks like a failure, and nobody would like to be the father or mother of a failure. So sanctions in that sense tend often to go on long beyond where they achieve something.
True. I find that the Obama administration, in my view, was more proactive towards Cuba than Biden, despite Biden being his vice president. I see Biden a little bit more reluctant to deal with Cuba. I mean, he offered vaccines, but he's not taking a more, proactive approach, such as Obama's, in my view.
Yeah. But often even Obama did not do in his first period. It's in the second period.
Yes.
You can't be re-elected.
Yes.
So Biden after 2024 might be different. Who knows?
Maybe. If he is re-elected, of course. Yeah. Okay, we have another question, and then we will have to move towards the end of the interview, for which we are very grateful. The question is by Silverio Perez. I thought about, sorry, it's a longer question. It says, what do you think of the work of countries like Mexico before the UN to seek a world peace? Are the speeches for peace effective, or are more specific measures needed that represent more effective actions? I thought about it because Mexico had a position in the UN against the embargo that the US applies to Cuba, and President López Obrador has also expressed itself in this regard. So what's your take on this, Peter?
Yeah, I'm not an expert really on what Mexico is doing, but I normally appreciate what I see, that Mexico tries to be a sort of a spokesperson for some kind of reasonable way in which you approach international affairs. And for me, that goes back to one of my real heroes who shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Garcia Robles in 1982 for their work on nuclear disarmament.
Yes.
And Alva Myrdal was the Swedish chief negotiator, and she appreciated Garcia Robles very much. And this year we have actually created a new center here in Uppsala called the Alva Myrdal Center, looking at nuclear disarmament. Because we think the issue needs to be brought back on the agenda. And I hope that would be a start of recreating some kind of axis between Sweden and Mexico on the nuclear issue. Because as I mentioned initially, I think there are still too many nuclear weapons around, and the dangers when that combines with the global situation, with the rivalry between big powers, it's not a healthy situation. So you have to tell me exactly what President López Obrador is planning or thinking. But in principle, my inclination is to be hopeful.
Yeah, he mentioned, if I remember correctly, he blamed the US for the embargo, which is a movement that was, considered here risky, because Mexico normally has been a mediator between Cuba and the US. And suddenly President López Obrador decided to support Cuba against the US, blaming the US for the embargo and the crisis of Cuba, which I don't think is very wise, but that's my personal view, of course. But yeah, that's what happened. But I guess you're right. When it comes to Mexico, the role played by Mexico, Sweden, on disarmament issues and fighting nuclear weapons. I remember, for instance, Olof Palme was in Mexico back in the 80s to support an initiative called the Initiative of Five Continents against nuclear weapons. And it was about, telling the Soviet Union and the US to diminish the amount of nuclear weapons because they were risking the security of the world. And there are many examples of initiatives developed by the two countries with other countries to, prevent the world from moving to a nuclear holocaust. So I'm happy to know that now you have an Alba Myrdal Center, because she shared with Garcia Robles the Nobel Peace Prize in 1982. Yes.
And of course, Alva Myrdal and Olof Palme went pretty well together.
Yes.
And actually, just a personal thing, the last time I saw Olof Palme was in the middle of February 1986. And that was at the funeral of Alva Myrdal. And he made a very strong, moving speech about her role and how important she had been for him and his thinking. And then 2 weeks later, he was shot and killed. So there is a close connection here between your center in the name of Olof Palme and our center in the name of Alva Myrdal.
Fantastic. Let's hope we can, develop initiatives in that respect. Yes. So, Peter, I believe we have to stop now, but I would like to ask you for a final remark, or, what would you like to say to the audience, considering that there are many young people watching this and listening to your views?
Yes, I would alert you to one of the more interesting UN documents that we have, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17, and they're all very fascinating and very important. And there is statistics monitoring are these goals implemented or not. And number 16 is about peace and about many of the things we talked about now, about the rule of law and things like that. But there are also a set of other goals set. And I mentioned to Maria Cristina that I'm involved in a project looking at the connections between health and peace, but also looking at gender and gender equality and peace. And what we discover is, of course, that gender equality is good for health. If women are having a stronger role, then, of course, that will improve the health of the family and in that sense of the society. But there is also a lot of findings saying that gender equality is good for peace, and that societies which have more of gender equality tend to have better records on human rights, have fewer civil wars, etc. So there are really very interesting connections. And these 17 goals are really important. They are like a plan for how to build a world. But you can say it also works on a local level. What do we do on a local level? So right now, a number of local communities in Sweden, which are official units, have their own development plans using these sustainable development goals for their own planning of their cities and so on and so forth. So I think here is a fascinating agreement among all the states in the world that we should meet these goals by 2030. It's 9 years ahead. And I think we should all look at them, monitor them, and see, are they being implemented, or what is happening, and which ones are not being implemented, or are some more crucial for the achievement of the others. And my hunch is that gender equality is one of the most important, because it has impact on very many of the other goals.
Yes.
So I would like to see more attention to these goals and these documents and this information that is provided, and that could be part of a big global discussion about where is this planet going. And or certainly the climate issue is one of the goals.
Yes.
But there are also important connections to peace and security that we have been discussing, and we should see that broader picture.
Yes, you are right, Peter. That's a pretext to have another interview in the coming months to discuss gender and peace and security and health. By the way, yes, gender is good for health, peace is good for health, and disarmament is good for health, of course. So we can probably think about this and discuss this in a forthcoming interview. Thank you, Peter. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us today. You have provided a lot of information and very, very important views on today's problems, and I'm really grateful to you for saving time for us today.
Thank you so much for your invitation, and I hope we can keep in touch. And if there are more questions or reflections, maybe you can just channel them to me, and I'll try to respond.
Great, Peter, will do so. And I want to thank our audience here in Zoom and in Facebook Live for following us. And we invite you, today we have another interview later on at 5 p.m. Mexico City Central Time. And we will be talking to the cosmonaut of Ecuador, Ronnie Nader. He will be discussing with us space security, among other issues. So stay tuned, see you soon, and once again, thank you. Bye-bye.